Most people feel like the world is getting more chaotic, markets whipping around, politics getting louder, institutions are losing trust. But what if none of this is random? What if not chaos at all, but it's a system doing exactly what it was designed to do? Now, today's conversation is about who actually runs the world and how money is used to enforce that power. Now, my guest is Simon Dixon. Now, he was speaking at Bitcoin conferences 14 years ago, right after Bitcoin crashed from $30 all the way down to $3, long before the institutions, the ETFs, or any mainstream adoption were even part of the conversation. And he spent decades inside banking, capital markets, and inside Bitcoin. But instead of reacting to the world as it changes, he studies the patterns underneath it. Now, if you're trying to understand why markets behave the way they do, why volatility keeps showing up at the worst possible times, or why Bitcoin went from being attacked to being embraced by Wall Street, this conversation is about to change how you see it all. So let's go ahead and jump right in with Simon. Simon, most people feel like the world's getting crazier. Maybe they can't really put their finger on it. They can't explain why. If somebody's going to watch this episode all the way through, what are they going to see about money and power? And they'll hear from you that they won't be able to unsee afterwards.
Great question. So, yeah, I pretty much spent my life for the last 25 years trying to unpack the financial system and the impact it has on corporate countries and individuals. I've been trying to help people understand that actually, and I think this is what's being revealed right now, that most governments in the West are fully subordinate to what I call a financial industrial complex. And that financial industrial complex, I call it a proof of weapons network of Bitcoin, because it's able to weaponize media within its structure of public companies. It's able to weaponize technology and algorithms. So you got the traditional media and the alternative media. It's able to weaponize military and covert, both overt and covert operations. And the structure of subordination for all countries, individuals, and corporations is really that financial industrial complex, which is, a complex of asset managers where everyone's contributing their money and they get these passive index flows into ETFs. The private equity and venture capital industry, the creators of all fiat currency through commercial banking, and the creator of all securities, both debt and equity markets in the investment banking side. And they've really mastered the art of what I call vassalization of corporate, country, and individual. And the individual level, it looks like indebtedment and all of your assets in a structure that somebody else custodies. On the corporate level, it's about borrowing against your equity value and being subordinate to debt instruments, passive flows through index funds, and really being on the right side of media so that they can control the narrative. And on the sovereign country level, it's about, covert wars, submission to financial weapons of mass destruction, and your ability to be able to have some kind of resilience from IMF debt and various other competing factions of power right now. And so it really is a Bitcoin story because it allows you to be sovereign at the individual level, the corporate level, and the country level. But we are very much in a struggle right now, I believe, for this same financial industrial complex to try and centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, and a recognition that they can use these debt instruments to really short-term control Bitcoin, and use it in order to submit people into not owning their own Bitcoin, but owning it with a treasury company, or borrowing against it, levering it up in custody, or holding it within an ETF. So I think that sums up where we are right now.
Well, that's a lot for us to unpack, Simon. Unfortunately, we probably need a couple hours to dissect all that, and we're not going to get through all that, but I want to dig in through as much as we can. So if I'm summarizing what you're saying, you're basically saying that power follows those who control access to the capital, or control the capital and access to the capital. It's not, maybe not the politicians, it's really all about the capital. And so There's a lot to dig into. Proof.
Yeah, the power is those that control the capital, but in order to get access to the capital, you have to subordinate yourself to that
Right.
agenda.
So if the power flows through capital instead of through the governments, then let's go back to the beginning. So the question then becomes historical. So how did it end up this way?
Well, I think we're at, this was a central banking scheme, as it were. Prior to central banking, we had different constructs and different structures. But when the British Empire was looking to fund its wars, it needed a structured vehicle in order to try and get as much access to the great British pound backed by gold as it could. And the Bank of England was created in order to create an accounting trick that was backed up by the taxpayers of the people to pay the interest on debt so that the government could essentially borrow as much as it can. And then it went siphoned off into the Dutch East India Company, so a private-public partnership through the creation of the currency. The interest was covered through taxation. And then you could use that in order to pillage countries so that you could gain access to real assets, whether it be energy in later, but originally it was mercantilism through gold, silver. And so this British Empire model, and that was created from the Dutch Empire. But once the host, the Bank of England, had successfully bankrupted the British government, and asset stripped as many assets as possible through its mercantile colonial expedites, it found a new host. And so we entered into the creation of the Federal Reserve after the third attempt in order to install a similar model in America. That required a war in order to reset the order. You had the funding through central banking and Wall Street of all the different ideologies. So you had the Bolshevik Revolution that replaced the Russian Tsar and its gold with the Soviet Union and the communist ideology. In the case of America, you had the Bank of England model, which was a debt-based Ponzi scheme that was packaged as capitalism in order to indebt all of the corporations, all of the individuals, and the government. And now we're at the end of that debt cycle. And then at the same time, you had the funding of the fascist Nazi movement, which was a mechanism for taking the gold that was at the Bank for International Settlements and changing ownership of it into the Federal Reserve via the Bank of England clearing system. And so we fast forward all of that. You got war after war after war. You got the same cycle. You got, the end of a debt cycle. And then round about the global financial crisis, which is the asset stripping phase, where you essentially, consolidate as much power as possible. Organizations like BlackRock ended up acquiring, because the Federal Reserve was using its technology and it was a contractor, it ended up acquiring Barclays ETFs. That gave them access to all those passive flows. They were able to, through the public markets, capture all of the media. The media under the military-industrial complex was able to get access to intelligence and covert operations to manipulate the media. Then we had several things like COVID, where the Treasury was then using BlackRock in order to decide how to allocate money. And through the Bank of International Settlements and Federal Reserve System, and the Fed is the main shareholder in the BIS, you had this network of central banks where you could wage currency wars on populations in order to milkshake everyone's assets and currencies into lending back to the US government, which was built upon this military-industrial complex that's now kind of turned into a technical industrial complex, which brings us into the creation of Bitcoin as an alternative resistance. But the power structures right now, I believe, are committing operations in order to strategically weaken the dollar, asset strip all of the Americans out of their assets through the US stock market, bankrupt the government through the US bond market, and then reset the world and hedge into multipolar blocks. And so there are several wars that need to be resolved in order to split the world into these blocks, which is based upon the countries that have built sovereign wealth by utilizing the dollar and utilizing and building a manufacturing base in the case of China. And that kind of brings us into the world we're in right now, which is a currency war environment, which I know it sounds pretty crazy, but it's actually a better version of what World War III would have looked like. I think we've avoided World War III because the world, through these trade wars and currency wars and economic wars, has determined what the world looks like and who's going to partner with this financial industrial complex and the role of each country in this new order that we're entering into right now.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. We just went through several hundred years of of history. It sort of sounds like the saying that nothing changes other than the names and the faces. So it's like we have this like regime that was assembled a few hundred years ago. The Bank of England was put together in the late 1600s, in the early 17th century, or late and it was put together to fight war. Right? They didn't have enough money to go fight the war. You sort of talked about how it sort of steamrolled through Europe, through the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, through Germany, just to kind of, I guess, continue to grow and centralize the financial system power, including in the U.S. And what we're seeing today, I think, is what you're describing is just a continued growth of that power network and the consolidation of it at the same time.
And we're getting a slightly different flavor of it right now because historically, capital has determined, money and power. Over time, money and power changes. So, it used to be in the Federal Reserve time, you had the, say, Warburg family, as the governor of the Reichsbank, which was mainly, the Bank for International Settlements and the Federal Reserve. You had the same families. Previous, the British Empire was connected to influential families, whether it be Rothschilds and various others. Then you had the Morgans and the various other families that were part of the American Industrial Revolution and military industrial complex. But what's happened over time is they created a construct where you had all these offshore trust structures via the British Empire. So through like the Cayman Islands, the Isle of Man, and the various other constructs where this family wealth was encapsulated into trust structures in offshore tax havens. And then by creating the dollar, which was the most successful operation to extract all the assets into essentially the hands of the few that we have right now, the dollar was a mechanism for the private bank to benefit from basically creating money through no fractions and no reserves. They called it fractional reserves. And essentially co-opting the government through lobby so that they control Congress, they control Senate, so they control laws. And then through this quote-unquote deep state and military industrial complex that gets access to Pentagon budgets by lobbying the Senate and Congress in order to print money to roll over the debt Ponzi scheme. And then you could control where that money goes and flows through the private banking sector, which is fractional reserve banking. Which is always the real estate, and then you have the investment banks that allocate the capital into the stock market, and then you have the Pentagon budget, which allows you to access, intelligence agencies to siphon money back into this. Now, what is an interesting trend I think we're witnessing right now is, firstly, the British Empire to the American Empire was kind of like the same type of power structure. But the American empire to this multipolar world of regional blocks, which is BRICS, the SCOs, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, ASEAN, the Asian countries, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and these African unions, they're all organizing around de-dollarization. And the financial industrial complex, they control the dollar, the pound, the Canadian dollar, the Mexican, the West, as it were. But they're managing a transition to sovereign countries that own sovereign wealth. And so that involves a negotiation between these regional blocks that control their own currencies that can't be subjected to, some of them are pegged to the dollar, so they need to break that peg. Japan is breaking the Japan carry trade. Europe is being turned into a war zone, which breaks the euro dollar. And so now you've got the euro dollar, the petrodollar, the pegs, the Japan carry trade that are all strategically weakening the dollar while they're negotiating with Gulf countries that are co-investing. And then at the same time, you've got a rising technical industrial complex. Now, in a world where money becomes less relevant because algorithmic control is what's important, you end up with a controlled power structure, which is also a transition. And that brings us into artificial intelligence, data centers, energy, Bitcoin, mining, and all this plethora of things that we're trying to unpack and figure out where it all lands at the end.
I mean, so when we go through this, we have, again, hundreds of years of this. And so back to the creation of the Bank of England, all the way up to 1976 or 71, sorry, this was all an equity-based system. So while meaning it was still a gold system, it wasn't really a debt-based system. So while there was certainly money creation back since the 1600s, it was still all around that gold basis. So then having gold or sound money didn't really prevent this system from happening. Maybe when it ended in 1971 into a pure fiat system, it allowed it to scale faster and more powerfully. I think if I'm understanding what you're saying properly, right, the system existed even under a gold-based, equity-based system. It's only continued to grow and expand in a pure debt-based monetary system.
Yeah. So those that controlled the goals. Now, this is where it gets into a Bitcoin and gold argument. The limitations of gold is the physicality of it and the lack of ability to audit it and then transport it easily. And so essentially what you happened, for example, in Nazi fascism under the Hitler regime, when Hitler went into Czechoslovakia, he had an arrangement with the Bank for International Settlements, which was connected and affiliated with the German manufacturing base and the Reichsbank. And all he had to do was persuade the Bank for International Settlement to change the label on the gold. So as Germany invaded into Czechoslovakia, the Czechoslovakian gold had a new draw and said, right, that's no longer Czechoslovakia, that's now Germany. And so you were able to change it. Now, the Bank for International Settlements didn't have the gold. It was actually held with the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. So ownership, and then you had to have this depeg between draining the gold reserves of the Great British Pound and transferring it over to a strengthening currency of the dollar, which meant that you could cash in on these arrangements to get the gold physically delivered into Fort Knox. And then once you had all the gold, by providing all the weapons and not being bombed, you were able to tell everybody or dictate the terms of the dollar, which is you will come off the gold standard, you convert your currency into dollars, we'll use the IMF as the exchange, the World Bank will lend you the reconstruction contracts, which is dollar demand. But if you don't like it, then you can convert your dollar for gold. And so we entered into the Cold War. World War II was resolved because America didn't want Russia or the Soviet Union to essentially defeat Germany. So you ended in this, this side. But then the military-industrial complex, which was the backbone of the manufacturing base, which was utilized to force the world onto these dollars, submit them into IMF loans, construct the petrodollar, construct the euro dollar, force the Bank of Japan into becoming a piggy bank for the American stock market. Once you've got all of the different central banks and printing their currency in order to lend it to the US government and purchase dollar bonds, you had this passive flow of demand that strengthened the dollar, strengthened the dollar, strengthened the dollar, which meant that if you were pegging your currency to the dollar, you were on the right side of the trade. But if you were China, you were essentially devaluing your currency, building your manufacturing base. And obviously in 71, the gold was meant to correct this. But when France turned up and said, give us our gold with ships, Nixon took America off the gold standard, defaulted on their debt because they wanted to basically continue the Vietnamese War. And then they needed to go into the next phase of war to fully bankrupt the US government, continue the debt-based Ponzi scheme, asset strip as much as they can. And that required a full fiat currency debt-based standard, which is where we went, leading up to the global financial crisis and all the accelerating events that are getting faster and faster and faster as we accelerate to the next phase.
So we went from the gold-based system, even though there was still a central banking model and money printing on a gold-based system, to then a pure fiat debt-based system.
Yeah, exactly. And the dollar then just became a function of how can you overtly and covertly force people to purchase and lend to the US government. And so you had this exceptionalism, which meant the world was printing their currencies, and in order to pay their dollar debt that was forced through overt and covert wars. And then once you repaid that, you were lending to the US government. The US government was then extracting that into the US stock market. And then the government was holding the debt. The average individual became productized through trying to enslave them with every type of debt possible. They were paying the 40% credit cards, payday loans. But the corporate class, they were able to borrow at 0% quantitative easing, create the dollar, create the debt. And then the function of the debt today is how can you get somebody to buy a US Treasury? And so this system works for as long as anyone will buy a US Treasury. And so you've got all the foreign governments right now that are essentially going independent. So Japan's increasing their interest rates and saying, let's repatriate capital, let's sell down some of our treasuries. You've got this European side where UK is essentially in a crisis, so they're selling down their treasuries. You've got China that's selling off their treasuries. As the dollar weakens, Saudi is selling off their treasuries. And then you've got this innovation within America where they're essentially deregulating the banking system, deregulating the pension system, creating crypto products like stable coins. And so the number one lender of and purchaser of these treasuries now is Cayman Islands, which is another way of saying BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. And you've entered into a cycle where now the Trump administration is saying, right, how do we roll over this debt next? All right, well, let's force the rates, the short-term interest rates down, roll it over short-term, and then we can dump those lower interest rate treasuries on Cayman Island through your pension, and we can basically dump the bag on the American people while we're thinking of ways to roll over the debt, i.e. market stimulus, $2,000 stimmy checks, 50-year mortgages, which is a multi-trillion-dollar rollover and bailout for the banks, 50-year mortgages, and at the same time, simultaneously, having America shrunk into a regional power rather than exporting all this debt globally.
Well, what about exporting the debt globally through stablecoins, which are a big imperative of the Trump administration, Scapa Cent, et cetera? So while all this is happening, and to the point that you're making, I mean, Russia and China have been trying to de-dollarize since 2013. This is nothing new. The BRICS have been trying to talk about a new currency and de-dollarizing for a long time. So this has been going on for quite some time. But as that's happening, we have dozens of currencies that are under double-digit or triple-digit inflation around the world, and those people want dollars. And so then they can get stable coins, which then thereby the stablecoin issuers like Tether, Circle buy U.S. Treasuries. So they do seem to be effectively sort of dumping this debt out into the world.
Yeah, so retail demand. So the dollar is propped up by these large multinational, important, global structures that kind of create these institutional and central bank demand for dollars. Now, retail is insignificant. So, all they've done with the Genius Act is essentially said, if you're a bank, then you can take your Federal Reserves and you can use those as collateral for your stablecoin. So that's not new demand for treasuries. You've got Tether and all the technical industrial complex. They're getting to create their own stablecoins. But so far, that's about 300 billion. This is like a rounding error in terms of what would need to happen to make it meaningful. So is new treasury issuance, which really is short-term treasuries, which doesn't make up the longer-term lending of the government debt. So it's essentially a mechanism for turning America into a distressed type of always rolling over the debt on short-term interest rates, which they can then get the Fed to push those rates down. But the longer term rates are going up, which is what you need to sustainably maintain the dollar dominance. And then simultaneously, all the central banks are selling their treasuries for gold, but they're trying to do it in a managed way, much like when the British Empire transitioned to the American Empire. It happened over 10 to 20 years. And I believe that the financial industrial complex is actively managing that transition and then negotiating with all the different blocks around like acquisition of resources, which is why you're seeing a lot of escalations in Venezuela and various other things. They're negotiating new terms for Chevron and Exxon. They're negotiating new defense deals for Exxon, for Lockheed Martin, General Dynamic. Essentially, they're asset stripping everything they can into the US stock market, turning the US debt through fiscal dominance short term, and then perpetuating this stable coins, which is short-term debt, which I think is part of them building their programmable surveillance state integrated with social credit scores and artificial intelligence, and seeing how much retail adoption they can get for that. But that won't create enough demand to reverse, the strategic weakening of the dollar in order to push America into a regional power.
So in a sense, you have maybe whatever administration, the Biden administration before, the Trump administration today, they're sort of managing, I guess it's the saying is like reorganizing the deck chairs on the Titanic. Like they're reorganizing here and they're kind of controlling what they have, but they don't control the ship. Is that a way to kind of frame what you're saying?
Yeah, the government,
is that what you're saying? So like the Trump administration, Scott Bessent, or the Biden administration before that, or whatever administration comes next, they're trying to manage the best they can, but they're sort of just organizing chairs on a deck. But what you're saying is JPMorgan, BlackRock, et cetera, are really driving the ship.
I mean, yeah, the government is 100 subordinate to corporate interests at this stage. If you look around every Congress member, you can see how do they get their funding. Well, from the military-industrial complex, the insurance companies, the financial-industrial complex, all the different lobbies. And that capital is not deployed for any other reason than that congressman or Senate represents their interest. All you need to do is look at who Trump was funded by. His number one funder was Elon Musk, representing the technical-industrial complex. His second funder was Palantir in there as well, and Peter Thiel. His second funder was the Bank of New York Mellon family, which is the financial industrial complex interest. Then you had Mariam Adelson, which is kind of like the Israel lobby, AIPAC. That's a subset of the military industrial complex. And you can look down at all the different politicians and see the agenda. The first thing that was announced was a big, beautiful bill, increase the debt ceiling to $5 trillion. They did a government shutdown to destabilize the dollar further. Then basically the Democrats were negotiating, how much money can we get to the insurance companies through these
Medicaid,
Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security things. And then the Republican side were just saying, how much can we get into AI military companies? Eventually you get that settlement, but they're literally just printing as much, reallocating that money to the interest that's propped up those lobbies. And the government is 100% captured across the West.
Yeah. So power struggles have been there since the beginning of time. You can go through any government as far back as history can show us, and there's power struggles. And as we've kind of gone through now several hundred years of history, doesn't matter if it's a gold standard, doesn't matter if it's a fiat standard, there's going to be these power struggles. And I would imagine as long as humans are on this earth, there's going to continue to be power struggles. So let's bring this down to more of a personal level. Why do I care? Why do you care? Why do any of the listeners care?
Well, I think it's important to understand the game you're playing in order to understand the rules. Because a lot of people are distracted believing that if you go from Biden to Trump, it creates like a dopamine of change that depending on your ideology, you suddenly get a hit. But then you realize the big changes are just one policy, and it doesn't make any difference. And so I think there's something very liberating in understanding that most people think that they're in a democracy where their vote matters. Your vote doesn't matter. What matters is your money. And so the political process is controlled by lobby. And if you want to engage in politics, then you need to be rich. It's always been for the rich class. It's always been that way.
Do you think that
You
that's
know,
bad?
I don't think there's any way of solving that or resolving that, because whether you've got a democracy, a monarchy, a communist, a socialist, whatever, it tends to be the richest and wealthy that set the rules, because money buys power and power is corrupted through money.
Yeah, I love this framing, Simon, and it's one I wanted to spend a few minutes digging into this. I was on a show just last week with another a prominent Bitcoiner. We were both guests, and they were saying how the system is broken and it's not serving people, and the millennials are getting screwed, and they can't buy houses, and we need Bitcoin to change the system. And I said, hang on, I look at it differently. Like, the system's working exactly as it's intended to work. Most people just don't understand the game as it's intended. And so if I were to bring a game over to your house, the first thing you'd do is like, well, what's the game? What's the objective? Who are the rules? What's the players? And if I can learn how to play the game, it actually works very well for me. And so, to the point that you're bringing up, there's all this asset stripping in the banks and the consolidation of power and reshuffling the deck of the world, which sounds really bad. But again, the question I asked you is bringing it back to individuals like you and I. What does all this mean to us? And I think what you're saying is that what it means is that if we want to get ahead as an individual, then we need to learn what the game is and who's playing the game, what the rules are. And then if we can play along with that game, then we can probably also do well with it. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, agree. And then let's bring this right down to the micros. So, once you understand how the system works, you kind of arrive at a point where you want to boycott the system, right? Fundamentally, we don't want to support evil. And so you ask yourself, well, how do you do that? And so I believe that the America became the dollar, and the dollar was created by the banks, and this financial industrial complex has been doing evil. And so you ask, what is how is that allowed? Well, it's through the Federal Reserve System. So you then know, okay, well, let's focus on the Federal Reserve System. I'm not going to be able to defeat this structural system, but how do I exit it? How do I boycott it? How do I not contribute to it? Because my personal belief, and this is a bit more philosophical, is that money has spiritual energy. And when your money is achieved through evil means, like supporting Palantir while it's doing all sorts of evil around the world, then it comes with a baggage and energy that I think drives you into more degeneracy, more gambling, more things that are productive and harmful, where you get the illusion of the success of wealth, but your life is a disaster. And so I believe when you achieve your money through, means that are fundamentally good for humanity in whatever you define that to be, then I found it to be more sustainable, and it actually multiplies further. And rather than ending up degenerate gambling in shitcoins, you end up doing things like sustainably investing, in Bitcoin in order to try and increase your wealth and then do good with your wealth. So fundamentally, how do you boycott the Federal Reserve? Well, you do that with either gold, which is what the central banks are doing today, or you do it with Bitcoin, which is what individuals can do today. But once you've got the Federal Reserve, who does the Federal Reserve work for? Well, it works for the banks because it's owned by the banks. And so you can then look at, well, who are the banks owned by? Well, they're owned by the asset managers. So how did the banks get there? Well, they create the dollar every time they issue a loan and turn you into a product where you're a debt slave to the system. And then they create the security, which is purchased via BlackRock via your pension. So you're paying for it, for BlackRock to buy it and own it. The bank created it by you signing a contract and a mortgage, but they got the dollars and they got to buy the asset and they own your real estate. So then you're like, hey, that's a bit of a scam, really. So how do you boycott that? Well, let's not buy my Bitcoin via the BlackRock ETF. If I'm going to buy it, I'll buy it and hold it in self-custody. And then what else do they want you to do? Okay, so take your self-custody Bitcoin and put it in custody with me, and I'll give you a loan against it. So they want you to custody it with them so that they can mine some fiat currency and get you in the eternal debt trap, so that when they manipulate the price by leveraging your Bitcoin in custody and creating derivatives, they want to steal your Bitcoin by trying to margin call you and get you into degeneracy and gambling. And so you can boycott that by not borrowing against your Bitcoin. Then you get further and right, I'm building my wealth. What am I going to do with my wealth? Am I going to invest in the stock market? Am I going to keep it in Bitcoin, or am I going to invest in decentralized local businesses that make my local community better? Or am I going to invest in Palantir and Apple and the S&P and just give more power to them in order to spend my money in their way and support this globalist infrastructure? And so you spend local and you invest local, and then armed with all of that, you can redirect the flow of money. If you get wealthy enough, you can engage in political process through your wealth. And that's how I think that's what I think you can do at the individual level. Now, if you've got Bitcoin wealth, what else can you do? Where you can escape your government and not be stuck in a jurisdiction that might be about to implement an exit tax or a wealth tax, or something that allows them to take your wealth and invest it in wars and military. And so this is the sovereign power. And by having it in self-custody at scale where you can spend it anywhere globally, you can start to build your own, import goods direct from the farmers in any country. You can escape a country if you think that it's getting too much tyrannical, and your wealth can go with you just based by knowing, taking your private key with you. And so I don't think everybody's going to do this. Most people are going to fall for the psyop, which is that they're going to buy a Bitcoin ETF if they do at all. They're going to hold it in custody with BlackRock. They're going to borrow against it. They're going to get margin called. They're going to go into gambling and degeneracy. They're going to go for the easy option of the S&P. So they're going to be investing in evil, and they're going to be giving BlackRock their money to make all their investment decisions for them. Most people will do that, but we need to maintain, why did Satoshi Nakamoto give us this open source code on a decentralized network where you can run a node and back up transactions? Well, he gave it for the few that are going to want to be free. And then you become the next elite, and hopefully you don't become as evil as the current elite because you want more sovereign power, but that's yet to be determined or proven.
Right. Yeah, what you're talking about, the energy, and it is philosophical, but I think I spent a lot of time thinking about that because you have to manage that. Jeff Booth talks about this quite often, like stop giving your energy to that system. So even just measuring things in dollars, like you said, investing into those dollar-denominated assets, you're continuing to give that energy to those networks. And so we have this opportunity to sort of opt out, create this new network. And so, that's what I do, hold Bitcoin in self-custody through my fund, Bitcoin Opportunity Fund. We invest into Bitcoin businesses so we can continue to build out the ecosystem. But you mentioned the BlackRocks and the ETFs, and if I borrow against it, I could get margin called, which is maybe the games they'll play to continue to try to get that Bitcoin from us, separate us from our Bitcoin. As they continue to do this, JPMorgan just launched this new Bitcoin structured product, which is actually a synthetic Bitcoin product, sort of like how they've always tried to co-opt gold or silver or anything else. So what are the risks? I can protect myself. I could buy Bitcoin that I could remember 12 words in my head, and I could go anywhere in the world. But if the JP Morgans and the BlackRocks are continuing to consolidate that power, what danger does that pose to me, even as a sovereign individual?
Well, it drives you to more long-term behavior because in markets, I used to work in market making. I know market manipulation very well. But in markets, it's very easy to manipulate markets short term. And Bitcoin's always been manipulated short term. This isn't a new behavior. I'm a shareholder in many of the exchanges. And I know that the goal is to get you to custody with them, trade, leverage, go into shit coins, and all the other games. It started as a simple model. But you end up in there. And those that want to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, they used to send like an incredible amount of Bitcoin over to Coinbase. People would speculate on what that means. You can then use social media and media in order to drive people to certain behaviors. When they started building Bitcoin-backed loans, they could then use margin calls. When they got you into perpetual futures and leverage and 50x, they controlled the game of manipulation. They were, that game. And short term, there's not a lot you can do about it other than recognize and know that you're not in that club. And if you're not in that club, you probably don't want to trade, but you can invest into weakness. And the whole own more Bitcoin every month type of mantra came about because the investors are all equal. Now, longer term, it's harder and harder because it's a fixed supply asset. But Wall Street, after Operation Choke Point 2.0, they built all of the constructs that they needed in order to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, take out the exchanges or co-opt the exchanges, take out the banks or co-opt the banks that were engaging in our sector, and then rebuild the entire Bitcoin financial industrial complex under the Trump administration. And so we've seen that. So now you have Bitcoin derivatives, you have vehicles for centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible. You have Bitcoin Treasury companies, which essentially, the most successful strategy has created a vehicle for Wall Street to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, because now you've created a game where there's 650,000 Bitcoin. Before the latest round, they had $54 million of assets, $700 million of liabilities. And so now you have to go to Wall Street, raise more money from the financial industrial complex in order to buy more Bitcoin. But now they have more and more influence. They can use the derivatives market. They can use money printing, which is essentially Cantor Fitzgerald as a primary dealer. You can work with Bitcoin Treasury companies to try and get them to issue stable coins and issue dollar loans against their Bitcoin in a Wall Street product. And now you've set up the entire ecosystem for what Operation Choke Point 1.0 destroyed. Now you get banks to have it on their balance sheet. You then get fractional reserve paper Bitcoin. You have derivatives markets. You have the hedge funds out there. And now the financial industrial complex essentially can try and use these products to get you to give your Bitcoin over to them. And, strategy is a vehicle for centralizing as much Bitcoin as possible, because he took debt instruments, perpetual instruments, and all these different types of products against Bitcoin, so that when you want strategy to sell Bitcoin or raise more finance so that strategy can become more subordinate to the JPMorgans, then you can use the short-term price manipulation, and you can use media manipulation, index fund inclusion, and money printing in order to kind of create these vehicles. And so that's kind of, where we are. You got ETFs to get all the passive money. You got strategy and Bitcoin Treasury companies to centralize in a subordinate structure as much as you can, using the debt markets and the equity markets. They then found a tax incentive to get as many old Bitcoin holders to centralize and borrow against their Bitcoin. So they've built this incredibly well, but making people believe that this is Bitcoin adoption, when essentially it's control of as many Bitcoin as possible to those forces to try and persuade you to not self-custody your Bitcoin. But the way you opt out of that, again, is you don't go for these products, you boycott the system, and you do the opposite of what they want you to do. And then you have this two-tiered system, which is Bitcoin in Wall Street, Bitcoin in the financial industrial complex, and Bitcoin in self-custody. Now, there's a bit of a battle that we need as many of the network to remain in self-custody, run their own nodes, because whenever there is another block size war or another war like the ones we're seeing right now, in order to have competing implementations that nodes are running, the only people that are going to play in that game are going to be the people with Bitcoin in self-custody and running nodes against Coinbase and BlackRock and all the others.
Man, Simon, you have opened up so many rabbit holes that I want to dive down into, but we're out of time, unfortunately. So we're going to have another conversation, because I maybe don't see things exactly the same way. And I think there's a lot of good conversation we could have around the Bitcoin Treasury companies. I think some of the Wall Street products, sort of the way the world is changing, some of the adoption stuff. So there's a lot of good conversations we could have on that. But the point, overall, of course, I agree with most everything. But the point that you're saying is we can just opt out. We can recognize the game. We don't have to play that game. I talk about being on a Bitcoin standard. Everything's getting cheaper for me while everyone's screaming about inflation and the world's getting so expensive. Like, stuff gets cheaper for me. I can just opt out. I can just do that. You can do that. Everybody listening can do that. We can take into self-custody. We don't have to play any of those games. And I think the big takeaway here is that what they can do is short-term manipulation, the volatility to continue to centralize power. But if we're out of that system and we're looking more long-term, we can just live through those drawdowns. We're not margin called. We're not playing with leverage, things like that. But we got to wrap it up with that. Like I said, there's so many rabbit holes we could dive down and have more specific conversations. I wanted to talk about recently what JPMorgan did, potentially to cause this whole market sell-off, starting with October 10th when they made the announcement, when Trump made the tweet announcement about China tariffs, and then they changed the margin requirements on MSTR stock. That's like a whole nother conversation we could have. So we're going to have to come back and have probably a little bit more pointed conversations. But let's go ahead and wrap this up, Simon. You're a wealth of knowledge and you've been in the space. I saw on your X account, which we'll link down below, you're speaking at a Bitcoin conference 14 years ago when Bitcoin had crashed from $30 all the way down to $3. Incredible. So, we're going to have you back, but let's wrap it up, Simon. Close out the show for us. Give us some parting thoughts and where people can follow you and pay attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. When I look at all the trends around the world right now, and even in the Bitcoin ecosystem, the word is control. And when I think about it, after these 14 years, what did Bitcoin do? Well, it gave people the ability to control their own wealth, spend their own wealth, and have a mechanism where a central banker couldn't change the monetary policy. And so, these centralizing forces are about, they don't want you holding the private key. They want to control your key for you in your Bitcoin. And you can look around the world and everything's about control, whether it's sovereign wealth funds versus debt-based Ponzi schemes. And that really is going to be the thing. So control is about, you thinking about you, your loved ones, your family, what you control, what you own, and how you can use that to protect yourself. And so, it's a big journey, but a few places you can get hold of me. I'm because Bitcoin gave me the freedom. My company didn't need Silicon Valley money because of Bitcoin. I didn't need to go public because of Bitcoin. And so I have very few control structures, and I live on an island where the government has no debt. So, it's all about control at the moment. And so I've got quite a lot of time. So I post a lot on X in real time to help people follow the money and see through the media and the lies of politicians. And I also tend to, as a discipline right now, go live once a week on my YouTube channel, where I cover This Week in Bitcoin and Tech, This Week in Macro, and This Week in Geopolitics. It's more like a discipline, so that I have to report the types of things I'm following the money for. And you can follow along, and I publish that on simondixon.com. So that's what I spend most of my time doing today.
Yeah, awesome. We'll link to all that down below for everybody. And if you want to hear more of these pointed conversations, drop it in the comments down below. We'll line that up. And with that, we'll sign it off. Simon, thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.